take up too much of your time today. We have a lot of material to get through. So I'm just going to briefly let you know who our gracious speakers are, and I've asked them to give you a little bit more information on their practice and their career in environmental law. So kicking things off will be Adam Riedel. He is a newly minted supervising clinical fellow at Georgetown Law Center's Institute for Public Representation in their environmental law clinic. And we have Jeff Davidson, who is a partner at Manatt, Phelps, and Phillips here in Washington, D.C. Adam and Jeff have been gracious enough to do this for us. I think this is year number 3, so we're really grateful to have a couple summer school vets back. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you guys. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Brett. I'm Adam Riedel. As Brett mentioned, I will be starting as a supervising attorney and clinical fellow at Georgetown Law Center's Institute for Public Representation, which is essentially an environmental law clinic. They run a public interest law firm, but they have an environmental division along with a few others. So essentially clinical professor type stuff. But briefly, just to give you my background, I went to Duke Law, got my JD along with a Master's in Environmental Science and Policy. Right out of law school, I started my career at Davis, Polk & Wardwell in New York in the environmental division. Then after a couple years at Davis Polk, I took a position at Columbia Law as the Associate Director of their Center for Climate Change Law. And then went to Manatt, where Jeff and I practiced for the last 5 years. And I just recently left about 3 weeks ago to just take a little time before I start next month at Georgetown. So that's my background. I'll let Jeff quickly give his before we start our substantive presentation.
Well, welcome. I'm delighted to be here again. And even though Adam has taken a step forward on his career path, hope that we will be able to do this together, going forward in the future. We have youth and we have older age. I'm not going to say it. The only benefit of being of my current age is that I was actually around when Superfund was first passed. When I first started practicing law, I really wanted to do Clean Air Act, sexy stuff. But they said, no, can't do that. That's already signed up for. You need to do solid waste. I said, that's not something I really went to law school for. And they said, well, you want a job? And I said, sure. So anyway, so I started doing that, and that morphed into Superfund. So we wrote a book, my old firm, in 1980 on RCRA, and then we wrote one in 1982 on Superfund. If you can still find it in print, it'll be all wrong and out of date. But nevertheless, I've been doing this for a long time. And so it's interesting to see. And I was mentioning to Brett, Ab and I have a case currently pending before our friends at Justice seeking a Superfund claim and a reimbursement, and I'm sure they'll be sending to us a check, momentarily, maybe on my desk when I get home. But nevertheless, that's one end of the Superfund practice. But going back to the basics is really educational for me, and I hope you'll find it interesting. So it's just, other background is that I went to Duke as well. That's just simply a pure coincidence. But I did a public policy degree as well there because I was really fascinated as to how public policy gets formed in this town and how it manifests itself in practice. And I think Superfund gives us a great example of good intentions succeeded and good intentions gone bad. And so we'll get to that when we get into the program.
Good. All right. So it's okay, I can just do this. So this is obviously the Hazardous Waste and Sites Summer School. So we're going to give you broad overview of the federal regulation of hazardous wastes and also what happens when something gets contaminated and needs to be cleaned up. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, RCRA, which is the primary federal statute governing the management, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste. And then Jeff is going to give a broad overview of CERCLA, otherwise known as Superfund, which is for when those wastes get out into the environment. So a little background just on what RCRA is. It was first passed in 1976 and then amended in 84, and it is the primary federal management statute governing the management and disposal of hazardous wastes. The idea behind it in sort of an overarching framework, if you want to think of it this way, is in a lot of ways it's a prophylactic statute. And the idea is that it's going to prevent new CERCLA sites so that there's not a constant cycle of cleaning up and new contamination. Now, the statute is very broad and far broader than we can get into in depth or cover every aspect of it in an hour, certainly. So we're going to focus on subtitle C, which is really the bread and butter of RCRA and what most people think about, and that's the subtitle with all the hazardous waste regulations. But just to give you an overview, it does also regulate just solid waste, non-hazardous waste. That's in subtitle D, and underground storage tanks are also regulated, and we'll touch on that briefly today. A term you hear applied a lot to RCRA is cradle to grave. It's a cradle to grave regulation, and the meaning behind that is it really does, in its goal of trying to prevent new hazardous waste sites, seek to track and manage hazardous waste from the time they're generated through their transportation to wherever they're going to be disposed, and then their ultimate disposal. So that's the idea, is if we don't lose track of these things, if we make sure everyone's doing what they should when they have them, then we're not going to have new CERCLA sites. So it has requirements for the generators, and they need to categorize and say what the waste is when they generate it. There's record keeping all the way through the transportation, and then the ultimate disposal. There's a lot of requirements of what a disposal facility or storage facility can do once they get this waste and put it to bed forever. Another point to keep in mind, just as I go through this presentation, a lot of time I'll talk about the EPA or regulators or government. Most of RCRA is delegated to the states. I think 46 or 47 states have approved RCRA authority. So at the first instance, states will have their own program, and it needs to be at least as stringent as the federal program, but it can be more. And some states have taken that opportunity to do so, notably California and New York, who in certain respects have created more stringent hazardous waste programs. So in the first instance, states have the authority to regulate and enforce RCRA and implement it, but if they fall down on the job for whatever reason, they're not enforcing, their program's not as stringent in implementation as the federal. The feds do have the ability to come in and overfile, which means they just really take charge and step in because it is a federal statute, so they can really reclaim that authority whenever they think it's necessary. So who's regulated? So generators, the people who actually create the waste. The transporters, the people who move the waste from the point of generation to the disposal facility, and then ultimately the treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, also known as TSD facilities. So again, sort of tracking it through the life cycle of the waste. So before we get into what everyone's obligations are, there's really a threshold question of what's a hazardous waste. It's defined as solid wastes, and that term, it does include liquid and gases, so a little bit misleading, but it's a solid waste that because of physical, chemical, or infectious characteristics pose a threat to human health and the environment. All right, so that gets us going, but solid waste also has a definition, and the material must be discarded. So if something has a hazard, has a hazardous characteristic, and we'll get into that in a second, but it's being offered for sale, right? So paint, and it's on the shelves of the store, it's not a waste because it hasn't been discarded. It's a usable commodity. Now, once someone that paint can gets discarded, then it's discarded. It's waste. And that's sort of something you always have to keep in your back of your mind, is this is not a statute that regulates all hazardous wastes or substances. It's got to be a waste. So discarded means abandoned, burned, disposed, or this term that in practice never really comes up, but inherently waste-like. It was sort of a catch-all to provide something from falling through the cracks, and allows EPA to say, look, that's so dangerous, don't even worry about whether it's waste or it just is. I think the only thing I'm aware of that's ever been categorized as dioxin-containing materials, and I think to date that's the only thing they've ever tagged as inherently waste-like. Because it's not discarded, certain recycled materials aren't solid wastes. So they may be, hey, I don't need this anymore, but I'm going to reuse it, therefore it's excluded from regulation under RCRA. So now that we've got the definition, if you tried to just apply those in practice, it'd be a little bit hard to discern exactly what's in and what's out. So luckily EPA helped us out with regulations that came up with a framework for really deciding whether you have hazardous waste or not. And there's two types of let's say, pathways to get to hazardous waste. The one is what's called characteristic hazardous wastes. And this is where the wastes have a characteristic that make them hazardous. And there's four. One is ignitable, and so that means it'll catch on fire without being ignited by a match. It's sort of, whether it's under pressure or something, it's almost spontaneous combustion. But again, it's not a piece of paper where, yeah, it's flammable, but it's not hazardous waste because it won't do without a match. Corrosive, which is really just a very high or low pH. Reactive, something that will react violently, again, under normal conditions. So, something that whether it mixes with water and has a reaction, whether it, again, under pressure will react, something like that. And then toxic. Toxic is, there's a list of, I think, 41 or 42 substances, chemicals, that if they will leach out, and there's a test with all kinds of methods to determine if it leaches out at a certain quantity, then it has the toxic characteristic. And there's tests for the others too, such flash point for ignitable and pH level for corrosive. So they all have very specific tests where you can determine whether it meets a characteristic. The second way to be hazardous wastes are what are called listed wastes. And so there are F-listed wastes, and these are wastes that are from non-specific sources. So benzene. If you've got benzene, it doesn't matter where it came from. If it's benzene, you've got a listed waste, and therefore you don't need to see if it meets the characteristics. You're in. The other are K-listed wastes, and these are very specific. They're from, and I gave an example, wastewater treatment sludge from the production of molybdenate orange pigment. Very specific. So it's, if you have this sludge, but it needs to be from this process. So it's a very specific list of industrial processes. And those are, so characteristic and listed are really the ways you have a hazardous waste. So in the real world, though, very rarely do you get a pure stream of waste, right? You're not going to typically have pure, again, benzene or, a waste that's pure. And so what happens if you have just non-hazardous waste mixed with hazardous waste or something else? So EPA came up with the mixture rule, which says that if you mix a hazardous waste with a non-hazardous waste, no matter what the ratios, it could be 1% hazardous and 99% non-hazardous, it's a hazardous waste. Now the caveat, and this is a good sort of illustration of why RCRA can be tricky for, lawyers, but the regulated community is, so if you mix a characteristic waste with non-hazardous waste and it loses that characteristic because it's so diluted, whatever, you don't have a hazardous waste. So you may go, oh good, I don't have a hazardous waste, I'm not in RCRA. Well, the problem is once you do that, you've now treated hazardous waste, which makes you a treatment, storage, or disposal facility under RCRA, so you're right back in. So again, it's sort of like loophole under loophole under loophole, and you really have to tease that out. And these concepts, just keep in mind again, thinking about RCRA, is it a waste? Okay, is it hazardous? Has it been mixed? And just, again, it's sort of the things you have to keep in your mind as you analyze RCRA issues. There are exclusions, though, from either the definition of hazardous waste or solid waste, which again will take you out of RCRA, and these are mostly for things that either are regulated under other statutes, so they're excluded, or politically infeasible or impractical. And so from hazardous waste, mining wastes, largely regulated under SMCRA, the Surface Mining, I think, Compliance and Reclamation Act. Yes, I don't do a lot of SMCRA work. But mining waste, and then household waste. So again, that's just a political impracticality that you can't have EPA running around checking everyone's trash can for a half-used bottle of Clorox. From solid waste, these are mostly ones that are covered by other statutes. So domestic sewage, industrial dishwater charges under the Clean Water Act. Those are, again, regulated by other statutes. And then recycled scrap metal, which falls under the recycling exemption, which we'll get into a little bit more detail later. All right, so let's start with the generators at the beginning of the life cycle. So this is any facility that produces hazardous waste, very simply. And so you have your industrial refineries, chemical plants, places you would think. Commercial, and I put the CVS because, and again, this is where the definition of waste comes in. If you're selling a bottle of WD-40 on your shelf, not waste, you're offering for sale. But if it doesn't get sold, if someone returns it and you throw it in the dumpster out back in your CVS, you now have you're a hazardous waste generator because it magically converted to waste the minute you threw it in the dumpster. And institutional hospitals, things like that, that will also have chemicals and things just used in their processes that become hazardous waste when they dispose of them. So what do generators have to do? Well, they're the generators, and so they have to do an initial characterization of their hazardous waste streams and say what it is, this is hazardous, here's how much it is. They have to have a generator ID from whoever their regulator is, and that's just to say, hey, I generate hazardous waste, you need to come in and make sure I'm doing everything right from time to time, but put them on the radar. They need to manage the waste safely and store them safely. So obviously the minute they have waste, it's not immediately going off. They'll hold it for some period of time. And so it needs to be stored appropriately. They have to create the manifest for the waste. And this is really the heart of the cradle to grave. This will follow the waste from the time it's put on the initial container through the transporter, through the TSD facility. And they have record-keeping requirements, and then also they have to employ their trainees, train their employees to safely manage what and know how to appropriately deal with hazardous wastes. So as far as storage, these are sort of common sense. They need to be in good condition so that things don't leak out. They need to have their lids on. Any storage, hazardous waste storage container needs to have a lid, except when you're putting stuff in or out. And it needs to be stored in a centralized location. Obviously, less risk of spills or losing waste if it's immediately sent to one place. There is a caveat to that. So for huge facilities, if you have a 40-acre chemical plant, it's really infeasible to constantly be moving this stuff. So they do allow for what they call satellite accumulation areas for a limited amount of hazardous materials for prior to centralization shipping off site. If you have a liquid and so you're storing in a tank, the big requirement is you have to have some sort of secondary containment. So you need double walling, an external liner or a vault, so just sort of a 2-foot concrete wall around it, but something so that if the primary containment vessel gets punctured, you have a secondary barrier to release to the environment. Generators are limited in how long they can accumulate waste in their site, and this is really to prevent the loophole of someone just saying, I'm storing it, I'll send it off, and just put it in a warehouse where then the company goes out of business and you're left with just a pile of hazardous wastes. And there's different amounts of time that you can store it on your site, and it relates to how big you are. The bigger you are, the shorter period of time you have to ship it off site. So if you're a large quantity generator, greater than 1,000 kilograms a month, you can keep it on the site 90 days. A small quantity generator from 100 to 1,000 kilograms, it's either 180 or 270 days, depending on how far you ship it. The reason there's two timelines is it's really an economic consideration. Shipping in bulk is obviously less expensive than constantly doing these tiny shipments. So if you have to ship it really far, and this is ostensibly going to be more expensive, you can keep it a little longer so you don't have to constantly do these shipments. If you are conditionally exempt small quantity generator, which means you're exempt from, you're in RCRA, but you get off on a lot of stuff. If it's less than 100 kilograms a month, then you can keep it on your site indefinitely. So I talked about the manifest. Because this is so crucial, we're just going to go into a little bit more depth, but it's in accordance with DOT hazardous waste requirements too, because this is going to be shipped, and the generator kind of knows what they have, but this is really to make sure it's tracked and gets to where it needs to be for its end disposal. It needs to be marked as hazardous waste, and I gave you a picture of what the hazardous waste sign that goes on any container. The manifest needs to be included with the waste, so it needs to go on there. And it's really got the generator's name, waste description, volume. It's sort of a who, what, where, when, and why of the waste. And it's really, again, designed to make sure this cradle-to-grave process operates. Now manifests can be done electronically, and I say now because EPA just got around to creating a system, I think, in 2012. Before that, everything had to be done by hand. And I mean, if you we're doing diligence, we're working at the big facility. I mean, you just had voluminous, like scribbled out things that you tried to figure out what it went to and make sure it was done properly. But the e-manifest makes it a lot easier to keep track of them. So how do generators get in trouble in RCRA? Improper storage. I mean, someone comes around, the lid's off, you got a violation. Usually you'll just get a warning and they'll say, put the lid back on and, remember to do that. There's usually not penalties with that, but improper record keeping or labeling, retaining manifests improperly. Again, less of an issue now that there's need for manifests. Storage of hazardous waste greater than accumulation periods, and improper identification or characterization of waste, which is difficult for facilities that produce sort of disparate streams of waste. And, sometimes it may have this in it, sometimes it may have that. So, generators can get tripped up on that as well. So transporters are mostly governed by the Department of Transportation. An interesting thing, though, is that RCRA, to deal with transportation, just incorporated all the DOT regulations by reference. So if you have a transportation violation, if you're a transporter, DOT and EPA can separately ring you up for the same thing because they're separate agencies. They put it in RCRA, but it's also separately in DOT, so you violated two statutes. But most of the requirements for transports are really just common sense. You got to deliver the entire quantity of hazardous waste. You have to keep a copy of the manifest, and if you spill it when you're transporting, you got to take care of it quickly. There is one small issue for transporters, and this is just due to the nature of transportation of hazardous waste, and it's called the 10-day rule. And we'll get to storage and disposal facilities next, but if you're storing hazardous waste, you need to be permitted, a lot of requirements. But a lot of transporters will go around and have their trucks go to, the print shop where they're picking up, a little bit of stuff, and then a big facility, and then they'll bring it somewhere for, railroad or barge or some sort of larger means of shipping to a disposal site. And so EPA said, well, if that's what you're doing, that's fine, as long as you don't keep it at this accumulation point longer than 10 days. If you go over that, you fall into the, you got to be permitted as a TSD facility, a lot of extra requirements, but they carved out this little thing to just make sure transportation of hazardous waste runs smoothly. All right, so we've now generated it, transported it, and now we're at the TSD facility. So this is typically the endpoint. They're going to get rid of the waste forever, one way or another. And so they will usually undergo some sort of treatment. And this is just any process designed to change the composition, to make it non-hazardous, to reduce the volume, make it safer for transport, reduce in volume. And so this is a pretty broad definition. So if you have plastic chips from something that, have a coat of a hazardous substance on them, and you just spray them with a hose before you ship them, you're now a TSD facility. So it's very easy to treat the hazardous waste. My advice to anyone generating is just don't touch it. Like, again, anything you do, and we've had clients run into trouble because, again, they did something as small as wash it. And it was like, well, why'd you do that? Oh, because it's just, it's going on the highway, and if it spills, it's like, well, you've treated it, so now you're a TSD facility. So again, they need to be permitted, and they're the only, generators need an ID, but they don't have to actually be permitted. And there are two types of permits. One is interim status, and this was really done at, included in the statute, so that the day the statute went into effect, the hazardous waste treatment disposal industry didn't shut down nationwide while everyone waited to get permitted. So all they required was that you're in existence the day that the statutory regulatory provision that catches you took effect, and then, which for the most part is going to be in 76 or 84, and then all you have to do is, they said, tell us generally who you are, what your wastes are, and then you can start working on the permitting process while you still operate. The permitting process is long. I mean, it's a big application and a lot of detail. It needs to be followed to the letter. A big part of the permitting process is you do have to post financial assurance. So they want to make sure someone doesn't operate as a TSD facility, take a lot of money, just dump the waste somewhere, in storage, declare bankruptcy, or, just run and leave leave and say, whoops, I'm bankrupt now, this money's gone, and leave another CERCLA site. So, and you have to adjust your financial assurance to match your operation. So if you grow over time and are taking more waste, you have to up your financial assurance to make sure the site eventually is not an orphan site under CERCLA. Also, TSD facilities need to do a very detailed waste analysis so they know exactly what they're handling and treating. So obviously the generators gave an initial determination, but usually the generators are sort of knowing what's coming in and generally have an idea of what's coming out. But because the TSD facility is going to be putting this, to bed forever, and they need to make sure it's safe, they have to do a really detailed sampling, chemical and physical analysis of what they have, and they need to do it as much as necessary to make sure they have a handle on exactly what they're doing. And there's a backstop to that, which is you have to have a written plan to make sure that you're doing it appropriately and that you don't have sort of a sliding thing where people used to test for this, but now we don't. No one knows why anymore. So you have to have a written plan and you have to follow it. And again, it gets into the nitty-gritty of the test methods and how often you're going to sample and the parameters of your analysis. So definitely a pretty stringent requirement on TSD facilities. So it's time to ultimately get rid of these. Really two ways that hazardous wastes are disposed of. One is land-based units. So this is just really a landfill. And the big thing with that you're trying to protect against when you have a landfill or surface impoundment, waste piles, whatever, is letting it not leach into the groundwater and really getting away from you. Once you put it in a landfill, if you didn't line it in some way, once it rains, you essentially create a toxic coffee filter. All that stuff's going to get into the water and then seep into the groundwater. So to protect against that, all land-based disposal units need to have double liners. So usually it's a plastic lining, and then you put clay underneath it, which also serves as an impermeable barrier. And then you need to do constant groundwater monitoring. So if somehow the plastic gets punctured and the clay forms a rupture and stuff seeking out, and then to protect against that, you need to have a leachate collection system, which will pump out the leachate and you treat it through a system. So sort of 3 layers of protection really against these getting out into the environment. So to put even a 4th level of protection against the release of these hazardous constituents, in the 1984 RCRA amendments, EPA enacted what is known as the land ban. And essentially what it says is that if you have hazardous wastes that are destined for a land-based disposal unit, you have to do some sort of treatment to make them less hazardous before you put them in the landfill. So and these are usually, one is that there will be a limit. So they'll say, okay, you can't have more than 5 parts per million of, whatever on this waste. And so therefore you need to treat it to get down to 5 parts per million before you can put it in the landfill. The other, sometimes it's a technological requirement. So you need to use this process on the waste before it can go in the land-based disposal unit. But either way, you got to do something before you can put it in there. You can't just dilute it to get it down, so you can't mix a whole bunch of other stuff with it to just get it down to that 5 parts per million, put it in. You actually have to treat it and remove that. You also can't just store it to avoid treating it. Again, these treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. But if you just don't want to treat it, you can't just hold on to it forever. You've got to treat it and sort of keep it moving through the pipeline. The second way that hazardous wastes are disposed of are incinerators. Most of this falls under the Clean Air Act because you're really worried about air emissions from what you're burning. You don't just want to volatilize the hazardous materials, get them into the air and have everyone breathing it. So RCRA does subject them, the hazardous wastes are incinerated to a removal efficiency of 99.99%. So you got to get almost everything out of there through the incineration. And then they're also subject to the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, the NESHAPs, under the Clean Air Act, which also have maximum emission levels for hazardous pollutants. So if somehow the 99.99% doesn't get you there, then you're going to have to meet the more stringent NESHAP requirement. So how do TSD facilities get into problems? One is unauthorized treatment of hazardous waste. And, I've dealt with permitted facilities where they make some tweak on their process and they say, oh, well, now we do this extra step in here. The permits really are enforced to the letter of the law. And so if it's not in there, you need to get a permit amendment, which again is a big hassle, so which is why facilities don't do it. But if you get caught, you've got a problem on your hands. If you don't comply with your waste analysis plan, you start to, again, it's a lot of work. We're just going to cut this out, or we use this shortcut. Inadequate financial assurance is a big one just because companies won't keep track of it. There's usually no malicious intent. It's just, again, they grow, they're doing other stuff, and someone notices, we haven't updated that in 10 years, and we've grown, 80%. So, and then an interesting thing, then, this isn't available to generators or transporters because they're not permitted, but if you have a permit and you're actually complying with it, let's say the state issues it, you're complying with it, no problems, and EPA comes in and uses their overfiling authority and says, no, this isn't permissible under RCRA. If it's in your permit, you're off the hook. Now, EPA may say, well, we got to amend your permit. This isn't okay. It doesn't meet the minimum requirements, but you will not be subject to any sort of enforcement action or other sanctions because your permit allowed it and you were following your permit. All right, so a couple little just things to touch on, which, again, are sort of, come up from time to time. One is the recycling of secondary materials. And part of RCRA, when they said, well, we don't want to create new CERCLA sites, but obviously if it doesn't go to a disposal facility at all, that's even better. So they wanted to encourage recycling, but it obviously offered a lot of loopholes that people would, maybe try and exploit to get out from RCRA and say, well, that's recycling. So they came up with a lot of criteria and said, if you want to apply or if you want to, qualify for the recycling exemption, here are some requirements. So one is it has to be used in an industrial process to make a product, or can be used as substitutes for some other ingredient in a commercial product. They can be returned to their original process. So a lot of solvents can be filtered, where they'll take out the stuff it dissolved or took off. You still have good solvent, can be cycled back through and doesn't need to be disposed of. So a couple of exceptions that they have said is not okay is, it's not okay to recycle it by putting it on the ground. And one is that, I'm not aware of a case, but I imagine someone did this where they had to say no, where they put it down as a roadbed. So you're really just disposing of it. But they said, no, we're reusing it. Look, we're using it in a road. And they said, no, you're just disposing of it. The other similar is burn for energy recovery. So you're really just incinerating it. And the fact that there's a co-benefit of electricity is nice, but that doesn't mean that you can just throw it in and don't have to comply with, the emission standards under RCRA. It also has to be legitimate recycling. And so this is another loophole that came up, which is people could just throw stuff into a product that was unnecessary and say, it was recycled. There you go. So it has to provide a useful contribution. You can't just throw it in somewhere that, doesn't make a difference one way or another, but you're saying, hey, it's recycled. So it has to contribute. It has to produce a valuable product. So if you, take your waste and craft it into, paper weights that you give away that no one has any value for and says, no, I don't really want that. Okay, you can give it to me, but I'm going to throw it away. Again, that's not recycling. It's not a valuable thing. You have to manage as a valuable commodity. Again, so that it's sort of proof of the value to the market. And it has to be comparable to a legitimate product in terms of hazardous characteristics. So if you decide, I want to incorporate this into children's, chew toys, those are generally not hazardous. So if you say, well, this will be great for kids to chew on, that's not going to be okay. Just touching on used oil, because obviously every car needs regular oil changes, and so a lot of waste that normally would be hazardous, but they carved it out. Again, just there's so much of it. There's so many Jiffy Lubes and small things. It just was hard to manage that. So it actually has its own regulations, its own program. And even if the oil exhibits a hazardous characteristic, it's still regulated under the separate regulations for used oil. But, and coming back to the mixture rule, if you mix that used oil, which is exempt with some other hazardous substance, now that mixture is a hazardous substance, as long as you don't fall into the other loophole where that removes the hazardous characteristics of the original, or the thing you're mixing it with. Universal wastes, again, ubiquitous. These are all the day-to-day things, light bulbs, pesticides, thermostats that have mercury. And again, so voluminous, it's very hard to regulate, but they do have hazardous materials in them. And so they came up with sort of a streamlined RCRA so that, again, there's some sort of management, there's recycling, but again, it's not as burdensome as the full RCRA statute and regulation. So they use slightly different terms, but it prohibits the disposal of any of this universal waste by handlers, which is really the term for generators. And they have to send it to a destination facility, which is, for these things, usually a recycling facility. So, and again, the idea was to not just have commercial enterprises throw their light bulbs in the trash can, but obviously it's infeasible for every building and business to have a RCRA ID number and go through the whole hassle. So you don't need a manifest. You don't have a generator ID for small quantity handlers, which is 5,000 kilograms at any one time. You can keep it for 1 year, so you don't have the accumulation periods, which are short. You don't need to centrally accumulate it. So really relaxing the standards for handlers, compared to generators. So again, as I said in the beginning, we'll touch on underground storage tanks. And they're everywhere. Every gas station has underground storage tanks. So there's a lot of exclusions because, again, you don't want pickup septic systems. You don't want pickup heating oil tanks. There's just too many of these to really address. So again, it covers a small universe of tanks, but again, filling stations are the one that comes up a lot. Most of its technical requirements to prevent the corrosion and leakage of underground storage tanks, a big problem in the past. There's still regularly see property development where someone pulls out a storage tank and is like, wait, what was in here? It's all corroded, it's empty, or sometimes there's still stuff in it and you got to get that out and account for, how much leaked. And anyway, so to prevent future scenarios like that, you need corrosion protection. So that can either be a fiberglass tank, which won't corrode, or cathodic protection, which uses electrical currents to protect from corrosion. And you also have to have spill and overflow prevention, so you don't accidentally overflow it and have it spill everywhere. And I just gave a couple of they're a little small in the labeling, but a couple of just examples of the leak detection systems and processes and an overfill prevention device. So if you violate RCRA, what happens? So states that have delegated authority have the primary enforcement responsibilities, but if they fall down on the job, then EPA can step in. So under RCRA, under Section 3007, they can gather information. They can order you to turn over information. They can do administrative penalty and compliance orders. So, they'll say, we're the agency, here's a notice of violation, and we need you to correct this or face fines and penalties. So civil judicial actions, interim status corrective action orders, and this is for interim status facilities. And this just allows them, if something leaks, to say, hey, clean that up. And then hazard monitoring, testing, and analysis orders. So again, you're just ordering testing and analysis. You think something may have gone wrong. And then there are criminal penalties. So if they're knowing and willful violations, right? So you're a TSD facility, and rather than appropriately treat it, you just throw it on the back 40. And you say, yeah, you obviously knew that you're subject to RCRA, but just did that because it's cheaper. You can face criminal penalties. Another way, and again, it's not a formal process that you'd call, an enforcement authority, but because the authority who would be doing enforcement also issues your permit, they always put in a provision in the permit that says, if I give you a corrective action order, so tell you to do something to clean up, you agree under this permit, you'll just do it. And if you don't, again, they're going to issue your permit, and they can hold up your permit reapplication. You have to reapply every so often. They can hold up your permit. Again, you've conceded that you'll just do what they say under the permit, which was a condition of getting it. So the permit, in a lot of instances, holds a lot of power. Jeff and I, before I left, worked on something that's been going on years in a state with delegated authority, and they just, again, they're still fighting about this for years, and the facility's operating, but the state won't give them a new permit and is just holding it. And it's like, well, if you want your new permit, which has some changes, I'm going to need you to do a lot of things. And so the permit is a huge leverage point for the government. RCRA does also have a citizen suit provision, and this allows individuals, groups to step into the shoes of the government if they're not doing their job. So if you're in a state that has delegated authority and they kind of shrug their shoulders when you say, hey, that facility should be permitted, you can step in and file a suit to make them do their because that's a non-discretionary duty. You can also sue to enforce if you're a citizen. And so you can, if you find a violation of permits, and again, the government will prosecute that or enforce against this facility, you have to give them notice, and they have a period of time where the government can choose to take action. But if they don't, then as a citizen, you're allowed to prosecute that under the civil side, obviously. And then if there's an imminent and substantial endangerment to health or the environment, citizens can bring suits to stop that harm. But again, if the government is already on it, you can't jump in front of the government and say, well, you're not being hard enough. You're not. If they've got it and they're working on it, then it's just theirs, and you're barred from bringing a citizen suit. So a couple of just interesting or emerging issues. RCRA is a statute that, given the number of new substances coming on, the number of new facilities that are built and are generating hazardous waste, there are new issues. So one is an interesting one that actually came up 2 or 3 years ago, but I kept it on because it's just I was like, oh, I didn't think about that. But there was, EPA was asked to make a determination about whether CO2 streams injected from carbon capture and sequestration are solid wastes. They said they're unlikely to be hazardous, but could they be a solid waste, which again, then you're sort of halfway to hazardous waste. And EPA said no. They said, we don't think they are, but they said, well, we'll, or no, I'm sorry, they said they are solid waste, but said we don't think they're going to be hazardous, so we're not really going to deal with them under RCRA, but said it's possibly they could be characteristic. I'm not sure how you would get there, just chemically and physically, but they left the door open a crack anyway to coming back and dealing with them under RCRA. But certainly an interesting, when I heard that, I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought of that, but okay. And then another thing is just showing that, again, how easy it is to get tripped up is EPA, obviously people think of the refineries, chemical companies, when they think of who might be subject. And years ago, 3, maybe 4, EPA sort of shifted their enforcement compliance. I think in a lot of ways it was because the ones who know they're subject and know that they're screaming RCRA, RCRA, and producing these chemicals, really have their stuff together, and so they're pretty good on this. But retailers were not thinking about, not telling their employees, and so again they get returns. They pull something off the shelf and they throw it in the dumpster, and EPA said, well, it's now hazardous waste, and you don't have your ID number, you're not characterizing it, you're not doing all the things generators are supposed to do. So Walmart actually reached an $81 million settlement to settle both criminal and civil RCRA claims. And again, it was a range of products, really, that they were throwing out. And Costco had a $3.6 million settlement because it didn't label and sort their hazardous products for disposing of them. Also, in this one, sort of ongoing, it's sort of ping-pong back and forth, but pharmaceutical waste from healthcare facilities. Obviously a huge stream of waste, and EPA said this is just hard to do, right? A lot of these are hazardous, particularly chemotherapy drugs are the big one. And so if you use a smaller dose, it's in the vial, you got to get rid of it, but a lot of those are pretty toxic substances. And so EPA said, well, we got all these this huge waste stream, and they in 2008 proposed just saying, why don't we treat them as universal wastes? And there was a lot of pushback from both the hospitals and healthcare facilities and pharmaceutical companies, and also environmental groups, and they both disliked it for different reasons, but pretty much everyone who was impacted by this did not like it. So EPA said, okay, we got your comments, thanks. No one likes it. Let's take it back in and try and do something else. Kicked it around. It's still sort of in EPA. Given the current state of things, I would not expect that to come out soon. I think it'll just stay how it is. But who knows? Anyway, that's everything. So I'll turn it over to Jeff, and then take any questions at the end.
Questions at the end?
Yeah, why don't we do it at the end? And we'll just, if that's okay, is that okay? You want to do it now?
I think we're good on time. If we want to take a couple.
Yeah, I'll take a
now,
couple.
let's do that. Because we do have some from the web I wanted to get to.
Sure. Yeah.
So Mary's asking for some, I guess, more specific examples of just trying to understand what treatments there are for waste before it's disposed. Just like, what does this actually look like for people that aren't familiar with the industry?
Oh, I mean, there's, again, if you have, I don't know, again, it can be as simple as, washing it. It could be,
Neutralization.
Yeah, neutralization. If you have a very basic on the pH scale, or sorry, acidic compound on the pH scale, and you dump lime in it, or something like that. And then there's more complex processes that I couldn't explain to you, but
Just based off whatever the product
exactly,
is.
yeah. There's
Another one from the web. Hannah has a question about the financial assurances. Do they work in practice? Do they actually cover the costs at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't happen a lot that someone just leaves, or companies are just not doing what they did in the 50s and 60s, 70s. Again, companies are more sophisticated, and if you're a public company and you have to disclose things, no one wants to disclose, yeah, we got dinged because we didn't leave enough money for cleanup. It just doesn't look good. So again, do they work? I think they work in ensuring that there is adequate financial assurance, especially for public companies. But it's not often that it's like, oh, this huge facility just went bankrupt, and there's all this waste spread everywhere, and it needs to really be cleaned up.
Okay, thank you. In the room, yeah.
To follow up on that question, is the financial assurance under RCRA mostly utilized as a corporate guarantee, or?
It depends. So again, they're going to look at, you can use letters or deeds of trust. You can use, you can actually put cash aside. A lot of it's going to depend on, because it needs to be approved. EPA needs to say that's okay. They're going to just look at it, and the strength of the company. And if it's a, $40 billion company, and the estimated cost of cleanup is $5 million, and they're probably going to be okay if you say, hey, we're pretty strong. Can we just do a guaranteed line of credit from a bank, or and not actually put the cash aside? But if you're like a small mom and pop kind of operation, and the balance sheet's a little, they may say, no, we want to, banks say probably won't guarantee that. They may say, well, you just need to put it in a trust fund or some other cash-based.
And you said that usually it's just folks forgetting to update their financial assurance. How often are they required to update their financial assurance?
They need to sort of so if you have like just astronomical growth, I mean, you need to update it to reflect that. If it's slower growth, you may say, this is still, you got to get, it's sort of based on sort of what your situation is. It's not like 5 years, because if you set a timeline, then someone who had a lot of growth may get to year 4 and there's just not enough money, and it can be a burden if you say, no, we treat the same amount of waste every year. It's 100,000 tons, and making them constantly review it. It's not really changing. So just they need to keep track of it and accurately reflect it, but it's sort of a case by case thing.
So you talked about the household and other exemptions. I'm just curious, is there a sense of like the overall volume of hazardous waste disposed, how much of it is covered under RCRA? Like, is there a significant portion that's not, or is it the vast, vast majority that's covered?
I would say I don't know numbers off the top of my head. I mean, hazardous waste from households, there's obviously more households producing, but if you think about what you throw out, I mean, again, you probably have most of the time you use all the stuff in a Clorox bottle or whatever, so when that goes, it's got trace amounts. It's not, you really don't have an appreciable amount, and that's mostly what's going to go out in the household waste. Whereas, again, the biggest sources of, solvent disposal and stuff, that's all the industrial side. So I'd say it's capturing a good chunk. At the same time, though, it's a material amount that's getting missed by the household exemption because people throw away paint cans, they throw away lots of stuff that's just, it's got stuff in it. It's just in small quantities, but there's a lot of people doing it.
And I think you'll see most municipalities have voluntary hazardous waste.
Right, where you
collection
can go
areas.
drop it off. I think it's not because of that hurdle of, I got to drive it to this place between, 2 and 5 on a Thursday. Jeff's right. They have these voluntary programs. I just don't think many people use them, especially for, again, there's this much left in the Clorox bottle and they just throw it out.
You can bring batteries to our front desk. I mean, there's all kinds of places that churches, stores will take back things like that. It's just a matter of knowing where you can take it.
Just following up on that a little, is for the household waste exemption, is it only for like the generator side of things, or does it apply to transporters and disposers like common landfills and just waste?
Oh, yeah. You're not going to be a TSD facility if you're just if you have to go to the town dump because you don't have curbside pickup or whatever. No, you're not a TSD facility because you're not, technically you're saying I can't take your hazardous waste, but you also can't rip open every trash bag and go through it. So again, yeah, they're not going to be a TSD facility.
One was on the permit shield question. Only applies to the TSD facilities, correct?
Yeah, because the other generators and transporters aren't permitted.
Right. So does compliance with RCRA preclude tort liability for a generator or a transporter?
Oh, you're saying if someone gets hurt by it goes to...
Sure. Say someone has a tort claim against, say you're a transporter and you have a tank for a moment, that could work, right? If you put it all together. I'm just thinking of, for example, you have the double protected tank, double air tank. You're doing everything by the book, according to RCRA, but there's still some sort of spill.
Oh, like negligence or
if there's or active.
Yeah, I mean, there's no shield in RCRA for civil tort liability under some other under state common law or whatever. Again, I think if you're doing everything by the book, you'd have a lot of defenses. Right. If you say, hey, no, I'm following the state program for the hazardous, just a lot of bad stuff happened, everyone's trained. But there's no formal shield. Like, well, if someone determines you did everything right, you're off the hook and no one can bring suit.
You'd just be relying on tort defenses like
exactly. Like, no, it's not negligent we'll point to what you've been told to do by the government, which is usually a strong defense, but there's no formal bar.
Okay, one more on RCRA. We've done some programming over the last couple of years on circular economy thinking. Eli's published on it. The idea that maybe cradle to grave isn't the right way. It needs to be cradle to cradle if we're going to move into a more sustainable, use of our resources. And we've had folks identify shortcomings in RCRA that, it is easier to dispose than to try to recycle certain products. Do you have any thoughts on how that impacts clients? Are they thinking about things as like, gee, I wish we could recycle more of this or use it other ways, but RCRA makes, do you have any sense of kind of trends under RCRA, how we might use it to be more sustainable in our manufacturing processes? Sure.
I mean, one thing is just because of the cost, you've seen the engineering of a land disposal unit. These facilities have to post financial assurance, and all those costs get passed through to the customer. So I think in some ways, because it's very expensive, clients are cognizant of, oh, will this have to go to a Subtitle C landfill? Because it is just vastly more expensive to get someone to take it to a Subtitle C than if you're just going to a Subtitle D, the non-hazardous waste. So I think there's pressure sort of inherent in RCRA because of what it imposes on the TSD facilities to reuse it, to find some way to not have to do that. That being said, you know, is there more that can be done to you know, use the statute that way? In some ways it's difficult because it covers such a wide range of different substances, and some are just, I mean, you just can't recycle them. They get turned into whatever they get turned into, or they come through as throughput, and there's just nothing to do with them. There's no economic use. There's not, you know, because people would love to always be under the recycling exemption. It's just a much cheaper way. So I think there are pressures already. You know, I'm sure if I thought for a long time, I could think of some tweaks that maybe would push it, but there already, I think, are pretty good incentives, and some stuff just is going to have to go to the land disposal.
But I would note that there's been a big push, of course, to reduce the amount of actual disposal, i.e. permanent land disposal, through the sustainability reporting initiatives. I mean, there's a great deal of effort, at least on the corporate side, to go ahead and issue an annual sustainability report. And one of the metrics they will always track will be the amount of hazardous waste. And in every report, you'll try to find a chart that shows this year we did 1, 2, 5, whatever % less. And so there's a great movement in that regard, which will actually reduce the amount of waste put into permanent disposal. On the other hand, you know, about 3 or 4 years ago, EPA decided that recycling was arguably potentially a sham recycling. And they had new regulations to go ahead and put additional burdens on things that some people thought were recycling and parts of the agency thought were not really recycling, they were de facto disposal. Members of the recycling industry thought this was an unusual burden, and they objected strongly to it. I think recently EPA just lost that case, or at least a part of that case in the DC Circuit. And so there's a push and tug all the time as to when you really try to go ahead and recycle it. But I think that there's a general trend, and certainly if you look at the European Union and the requirements that they have for recycling electronic components, you'll see automobiles coming from Europe that'll say this car is 99% recyclable when you're done with it. There's a variety of other societal programs, regulations, and otherwise that basically are pushing people to prevent the final landfill disposal option.
But generally, RCRA can handle those changes in its current form, you think?
I think so. I mean, again, there's recycling exemption. There's the, you know, indirect costs imposed by Subtitle C landfills. There's a lot in there. And again, EPA's tried to strengthen it, but I can't think off the top of my head of, oh, here's one huge change that would appreciably increase, you know, how many people are recycling.
Yeah, I think that, you know, it's amazing how many new things you learn, even though something's been around since 1980. So I think that if you look back 10 years ago, you wouldn't see a lot of EPA involvement, enforcement, or interest in the retail big box disappearance. So people went to all your large retailers that Adam noted, and the retailers just threw this stuff out. That didn't occur to them that this was actually breaking the law. Now, if you go to the Retailers Association annual meeting, you'll see a large component of their meeting devoted towards RCRA compliance. And so I think that we'll continue to learn new sources of waste and come up with new and hopefully more efficient ways of disposing it, or at least managing it to reach the goal that I think ELI was looking towards.
All right, thanks so much. That's great. Thanks, Adam, for all that. Jeff, you want to take it over?
Sure. How do I push this button?
I'm just using the keyboard.
This one here?
Yep, down,
All right.
just down.
All right. Well, Superfund follows RCRA because Superfund was passed in response to what they thought was a major failing of RCRA. It's interesting how Superfund came about. It's maybe apocryphal, but it's a great story, and it's been told so many times it's probably true, which is that an early court decision looking at trying to clean up the site under RCRA, the court said RCRA is all written in the present tense, so it can't really deal with past conduct or past disposal. And everyone said, oh my God, you know, they can't do that. So in the fall of would have been obviously November 1980, Ronald Reagan gets elected. So Jimmy Carter is on his way out. So they call the lame duck section of Congress to come back in to put some other pieces of legislation in place prior to the time that Ronald Reagan shows up. Of course, Mr. Reagan will appoint Ms. Gorsuch, the mother of the current Supreme Court justice, to run his EPA. And there were people who were all concerned about where that might go, right or wrong. So in any event, Superfund was born in the middle of December. Adam failed to point out he's also been a congressional staffer in his youth. And everyone got together and put together this Superfund bill. It never went to conference. It was never really debated. No one really knew what they wanted to do. Everyone knew, however, they wanted to get this thing cleaned up because Love Canal had come along. And they said, we thought we solved this problem with RCRA. But no, the RCRA didn't actually cover all these other contaminated sites that were popping up around the country. And people were saying there's no legal obligations for that. And voila, Superfund was passed, put into effect right before the new administration of President Reagan, and off EPA, and off it goes. It's interesting. And I'll get to this in 1 second. When you sort of know what programs are important when your friends here in the city are interested in getting the various EPA departments and agencies. Well, no one was exactly running to the Superfund crowd. They were still into the Clean Water Program. They were into the Clean Air Act program. This whole thing was not really necessarily an enticement. But the Superfund has grown to be, I would argue, probably in many ways the most successful environmental program the country's ever put in place. It's certainly, given its breadth, one of the largest, if not the largest, actual environmental program that's run by the federal government. It's intended, by definition, to identify, investigate, and clean up contaminated lands, waters, and sediments to ensure protection of human health and the environment. And about a year ago, EPA had a big birthday party in 2015 because it was 35 years old. So EPA went out and they put all these metrics together to talk about how large the program really was. And you could see, just going through there, all these potentially responsible party searches, cleanups, almost 7,000 sites, $35 billion secured from the private sector to perform cleanup work. Overall, $42 billion spent on EPA Superfund. Now, as you read the paper, we're talking about a wide range of different budget objectives and goals from various parties here in the city about what it will look like. No one's talking about giving EPA $42 billion. But you can see over the last 35 years that the Superfund program actually generated $42 billion worth of actual environmental response to protect human health. I would call that a pretty successful program. Now, so I said, well, I wonder what happened last year. So I got the data from 2016. Well, we'll talk about this in some detail a little bit. 15 sites were added to the national priorities list. That's the list of the most contaminated sites. $1 billion was obtained in private party commitments, for cleanup. And EPA collected for its own budget, and this is $91.8 million in private party cost recovery. So if you have a site and EPA is overseeing you, and Adam and I read these bills, you'll get a bill from the government that'll just look like any other bill you get. And it'll say, Mary Jo worked for 5.6 hours on your case, and her billing rate is so-and-so, and they add it up and they send you a bill. That's an oversight cost. And you're obligated to pay it. And my client last week or so forgot one, and we got a pleasant but reasonably stern remembrance letter from our friends at the EPA that said, oh, maybe it slipped your mind, but you owe us this amount of money, and by the way, here's this interest rate if you don't get on it really quick. So EPA Superfund program has created a large program over the years. Now, one thing that's interesting, now we're not going to sit here and talk about the Trump administration and Administrator Pruitt very much. That's not the purpose of a Superfund primer course. But Administrator Pruitt has made, I thought, an interesting statement just a couple weeks ago, and it goes right to the purpose of our program. He says, and this memo you can read online on EPA's website, prioritizing the Superfund program. And the administrator says Superfund will now be, for the next 4 years, restored to its rightful place at the center of the agency's core mission. Now, that might be code for others for them not doing other things. I don't know. But I do know that the Superfund is as a new focus of EPA. And there's a variety of good ideas that are also in that memo about how EPA is going to expedite these cleanups and move these cleanups along so they don't last for years and years and years and sort of legacy sites. So it's a good time for us to talk about Superfund. Of course, according to the administration, this is their key program, and it's core to what EPA will be doing over the next 4 years. So what are the key Superfund policy concepts that are out there? And again, I'll just read this broad concepts. One, it fills in the gaps in related laws. It fills in the gaps for the RCRA program that Adam was just talking about. It also fills in the gaps for other environmental programs the federal government's had on the books since 1898, 95, whatever Rivers and Harbors was, and various state departments. One of the other concepts are polluters pay. Not the government pays, the polluters pay. That's an organizing concept that is really quite unique and critical of this concept. Enforcement first. We've talked to you about paying first, and then we'll talk about other issues later. EPA has an enforcement first policy under Superfund, which they've always had. Also, federal facilities are included. In fact, some of the largest polluters in the United States are the Department of Defense, both historically. Now, this is not to say that what they did was bad or wrong or illegal or inappropriate or immoral. The truth is that what the United States military does is creates a lot of waste and it leaves it where it finds it, where it drops it. And so the Defense Department and other federal agencies are just as liable as anyone else in the private sector. The private sector secondary shadow implementation dwarfs the formal program. This is a Jeff Davidson observation, which you may not agree with, but I can say after doing this for 35 years, I think the greatest success of the Superfund program is the fact that it has created this shadow program of cleanup that results in cleaner sites, greater environmental protection, greater human health protection than any actual federal operation or government operation can actually do. I will guarantee to you today at whatever we are here at 1:10 in the afternoon, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of deals that are being done today. People are selling businesses, they're selling real estate. If you look at the definition section of every single deal, they will simply borrow Superfund's definitions. They will all say, this is what I rep and warrant that this site is clean or it's not clean. What constitutes the structure of their understanding of their responsibilities and how sites will be cleaned up, if not, is all set by Superfund. So whether it intended to do this originally or not, Superfund has acted to motivate and organize. It's the intellectual infrastructure about how we think about contaminated properties, what's safe, what's clean, what we should do something about, what we can let go. All this is set forth by the EPA, by the statute, by the guidance that EPA puts out, and by the regulations, because the rest of our country, all 300 million plus people from coast to coast, read these regs and they direct their conduct to be in conformance with it. And we'll get to an important program in a second. EPA allowed private parties to maintain risk shifting privately under contract. And so that says, yeah, I may be liable in Superfund, but if you agree to buy this, you'll agree to take this responsibility. So there's a huge amount of EPA, quote, Superfund enforcement that takes place separately and apart from any governmental activity. And finally, not to be outdone, every state in the country now has some form of Superfund law, some form of state law. And many states in the EPA regions will have a memorandum of understanding allocating as to exactly how they will share responsibility for certain types of sites. Ab and I, a couple weeks ago, got an MOU from a state that said, this is something else we've heard about. What do you guys think about this? And we'll think about this MOU about how, people may share responsibilities in cleaning up particular sites. So, anyway, why Superfund in 1980? Because, as I mentioned, people thought RCRA wasn't going to be able to clean up historical dump sites where no responsible parties there was no further conduct going on. Why RCRA and Superfund? Because they address two sides of the same problem. as Adam, I think, clearly pointed out, RCRA is intended to prevent future Superfund sites by getting your conduct today so you don't create waste. Superfund is for everything else that still creates an environmental problem today, but you don't have a RCRA handle on it. Step 3, liability for whom, for what? We'll see that Superfund creates a huge net of liability, and we'll find out that it will be strict and strict liability, joint and several. Well, if you're in the net, you're stuck like a spider web. You can't get out. Next step, we'll talk about if I'm innocent, how do I escape? You know, I can't tell you how many times in my career I've been in meetings where people say I'm innocent as if this is some kind of criminal case. Right? Superfund is a civil statute. There's no criminal aspect of Superfund. Well, there's a tiny little aspect which we won't bother to get into. So the next question, all right, how does Superfund site get cleaned up? All right, let's say all this stuff is true. How do we go through? How do we get out of this? Superfund site costs. Oh, I just gave you the amount of money that was been spent, billions and billions. How are those costs incurred? Step 8, how does this really work in practice? You know, all right, so much of this is an interesting academic discussion. How does it really work? What are the nitty-gritty? Step 9, how do I make myself whole? Let's say I'm into the Superfund web and I think that I'm being treated unfairly. How do I basically get out of this? The practical problem is step 10. Okay, I want to go ahead and expand my business. I want to go ahead and move my property. I want to go ahead and move. How do I, but the property I want is contaminated. How can I do that and not be tied up into Superfund? And finally, there's the distinction between cleanup costs and natural resource damages. Superfund costs covers those as well. We'll talk about that. How do I get out of it? And finally, the last 2 questions, is Superfund liability perpetual? I entitled this 12 Steps to Superfund Sanity because the questions that we often hear is, I can't believe you're telling me I got this liability. This is crazy. You know, I didn't do anything here. I didn't create any pollution. This is crazy. I can't take this. This is unconstitutional, which was an early question, not resolved in the operator's favor. This is a conspiracy of, you name the historical totalitarian regime, and you're all agents of totalitarian people trying to subvert my freedoms because you're taking away all my money because of this issue. I mean, we won't, and Superfund is bad word. We won't get into that because we're on a webinar, you know, but all those things are there. So this is what we're going to try to cover very quickly here, and then we'll get into some interesting, hopefully, questions. Why Superfund in 1980? As I mentioned, you hit it pretty, oh, thank you. We'll go back. Look at this. Yeah. There you go. You know, doubts were addressed right after RCRA were passed, but whether there was sufficient federal authority to get sites cleaned up. As I mentioned, RCRA is forward-looking, and Superfund is backward-looking. One of the important things down here, as I'll mention, Superfund established a broad liability scheme, and we call them responsible parties, responsible persons, to enforce this polluter pays process. Superfund authorizes the government to take action if the private sector won't, and originally established a fund to finance certain cleanups, originally paid for by oil import fees. And it actually established its own release reporting obligation similar to the Clean Water Act for reporting spills, so people know about a site at its inception before it gets a chance to metastasize and become worse. If you combine RCRA and Superfund together, and there's a part of RCRA that, because we're in an introductory course by corrective action, Adam didn't go into, but between RCRA and Superfund, we have an overarching federal program to clean up contaminated sites. Now, why you need to know about both of these and why we do this in tandem is that but they do basically work together, and you're not going to have an understanding of how we deal with contaminated properties and protection of human health, the environment, unless you understand the RCRA program and the Superfund program. RCRA, you have strict rules and obligations and an enforcement scheme that Adam went through. CERCLA is largely self-implementing. There isn't any CERCLA police per se that's out there by EPA or the states that go around. They require you to do that. Liability under RCRA stems from, and this is an interesting question because it went to a little bit of the liability shield question, Brett, that you were asked. RCRA liability comes from failure to conduct your business and yourself in a way that the regulations require. Superfund liability is strict liability without regard to fault, and it's subject to very limited defenses. So if we go through these categories of responsible parties, I'll tell you about in a second, you will potentially have Superfund liability. It can be contingent, and you wouldn't have done anything. So that's a major distinction. RCRA applies to a huge universe of potential waste. We talked about, even we keep finding them, like in the retail situation. Should have had a V8, didn't know that was a waste. Well, Superfund applies to virtually every chemical in the world. Superfund deals with hazardous substance and contaminants and pollutants. It's virtually impossible to find a limit to the amount of waste and chemicals and toxic materials Superfund can actually cover. So Superfund fills the gaps. It's not just conduct, it's status. It's not just a limited group of waste, it's everything. And liability is broad and without limit. So where's this liability come from? Liability goes to current owners and operators of the facility where there has been a release of a hazardous substance. So if you have a property, a facility, and it has a hazardous substance on there, doesn't make any difference whether you just inherited this property yesterday, whether you bought it, you're liable under Superfund. Past owners and operators, when these materials were released, they also are in this chain of liability. A person who arranged for disposal of a hazardous substance at this property, at this location, they're also strictly liable. Under Adam's scheme, a transporter was supposed to take the hazardous waste to a licensed TST facility. Fair enough. In the CERCLA scheme, if you transport this to this place, whether it be a dump, maybe it be a school, maybe it be any place, you are in the liability chain. And finally, the person who arranged for that disposal is that. So very quickly, when Superfund was originally implemented and interpreted by the courts, the courts ruled Superfund liability was strict, but also presumptively joint and several. In a real quick legal mean, that means that if you and I are in a car accident and we both run the red light and we both end up creating damage, arguably we could apportion that in some fashion. Joint and several means that if the damage is $100, I owe $100 of that, or I owe $1 of that. Doesn't make any difference. I have joint and several liability, and the other party owes anywhere from $1 to $100. You work out your own share of that independently of that, but the liability is joint and several. Liability is retroactive. It goes back in time. Even if you have nothing to do with it, it's retroactive. The liability scheme is intentionally draconian, and the early court decisions would say, we understand this is draconian and we grant this is a very broad-reaching program, but the problem is we've got all these historically contaminated sites. Someone's got to pay. The polluter needs to pay. It shouldn't be the government. You got to go ahead and do this. Now, what does the liability exist for? We'll say, okay, Jeff, you've got Superfund liability. Liability exists for all costs of removal remediation incurred by the United States or the state or Indian tribe that are not inconsistent with a national contingency plan. Now, I don't know whether you've covered this, Brett, in your other summer courses, but under the Clean Water Act, the National Contingency Plan was originally developed to clean up spills to the water. So the NCP was an historical concept in EPA programs where you would run out and you'd clean up oil spills generally. Well, they modified the NCP to clean up spills on the land and in sediments and other areas that the NCP didn't originally cover, and it's a cleanup program. Liability exists for any other person that's not, if consistent with the NCP. And note that the way that the Congress did this, if I'm the government and I want to incur costs and I want to ask one of you here because you own the property to clean it up, I just simply have to be not inconsistent with this part of 40 CFR 300, which is about this thick. Lots of detailed requirements. Just have to be not inconsistent with that. But if I'm a private party and I want to recover my costs, I need to be strictly consistent with the NCP, which is a much tougher burden to be done. You're also liable for natural resource damages, and you're also liable for the cost of health risk assessments. Now, there are a couple of key things about what Superfund does not do or cover, which always trip people up. And this was debated briefly in 1970 and 1980, and it's remained the same ever since. Liability does not exist for bodily injury. If you live on a contaminated site, and it was contaminated by these other responsible parties, and you get sick or if you die of cancer, there is no CERCLA liability for you. You may have liability claims under tort law or other schemes of compensation, but Superfund was intended to be a cleanup statute, and they didn't want to get it involved in bodily injury cases. And to the most part, to my knowledge, all the states that have enacted similar cleanup statutes have also decided to exclude bodily injury and personal injury claims from the cleanup statute itself. Now, there are a lot of common misunderstandings despite everything I just told you. The mere presence of hazardous substance in the environment does not mean Superfund liability exists. If you own a property or if you drive by a property and you think, oh, I think I see contamination, that doesn't mean there's automatically a Superfund liability. So the mere presence of a hazardous substance someplace does not also mean that there's Superfund liability. And my favorite, because we work with our corporate friends and do a lot of deal work, and someone will say, that site's, you're illegal under Superfund. That site's contaminated. That's illegal. Well, there's nothing illegal about having contamination, on a particular piece of property. If EPA takes an order and you violate the order, well, then there's some illegality possibility there. But generally speaking, the presence of a contaminant in the environment of a hazardous substance basically gives you a contingent liability if that contaminant in the environment creates an unreasonable risk to human health and environment, and the provisions of the NCP establish an obligation to respond. But I've taken all my life the Amtrak train between here and New York, and I've always looked out, along the tracks and saying, well, boy, this looks pretty dirty here. This looks like this is pretty contaminated, but I don't see any Superfund activity going on. I don't see any cleanup going on. Well, that's because the mere presence of contamination doesn't automatically create a Superfund liability. It's simply there. Now, if in fact you fall into one of those categories, current owner-operator, past owner-operator, time of release, someone who arranged for the disposal, your defenses are pretty limited. Your acts of God, I don't know quite what that means, but it hasn't been too well interpreted, but acts of war, and acts of an unrelated third party for which you have no commercial relationship with. So by and large, Superfund liability, if you're tagged, you're basically it. Not to say you can't try to argue a defense, but for the most part, if you're in one of the four categories, you will have some share of Superfund liability. Now, when Superfund was first came out, the early decisions that try to work through it, I think there was a great learning curve on the part of the courts. There was a great learning curve on the part of the agencies, and learning curve among the consultants and engineering teams that worked on this. Early days said that if you had waste that you put into a landfill, not a RCRA landfill, and you put in 1 pound of something and someone else put in 15 million pounds of something, there was a synergistic chemical effect so that your liability would be the same as everybody else's. I think that misunderstood the engineering, misunderstood the science, but Second Circuit decision was followed for many years that simply said, once you're in for a dime, in for a buck, in for $100, in for $1 million, it didn't make any difference. But as time has gone on, the courts have moved more towards the divisibility and understanding. And the question is now whether divisibility of contamination, not simply joint several liability, is gaining traction. In other words, if you're able to say, I've got a site, $100 need to be spent to clean up the chrome, I put in 1 pound of spent oil no one cares about that. It's a stain on the pavement. No one's cleaning that up, but they are cleaning up everything else. That's a divisibility argument, and there's been some success recently that's saying I have zero CERCLA liability in that context. Now, also, from an overview standpoint, there are other ways to avoid Superfund liability. I mentioned 107E, contractual liability shifting and indemnity agreements were not prohibited by Superfund. Whether this was, as I mentioned before, an intentional act of the Congress and with great insight, or whether it was just an accident, they allowed people, having given this liability scheme and having that put in place, to arrange privately among themselves. And so transactions today, real estate transactions, corporate transactions, all manner of transactions take place where people will negotiate under a deal. They'll shift, you're allowed to shift liability. Now that liability shift, if I decide to do a deal with Adam and he says, okay, Jeff, I want what you have and I'll indemnify you, that's a contractual obligation I can enforce. Now, if Adam eventually goes bankrupt or leaves country, decides to renege on his obligation, not that I've ever seen him do that, but if he were to do that, and I would tell EPA, I said, well, I'm sorry, I got to deal with Adam. He says he's going to take care of it. That doesn't get me out of my fundamental liability to the government. I still need to go ahead and be responsible. But this practical aspect of environmental liability shifting through contract and indemnity provisions has worked miracles in our country, because sites development would have not taken place absent the ability to private parties to arrange to calculate the cost of this liability and fit it into the broader business scheme or the broader economic scheme that affects it. And finally, insurance products. We could spend the next 6 months talking about environmental insurance. Originally, people had insurance products, and then the insurance industry said, well, this isn't going to work. Recently, insurance products have come back in vogue. In any event, most states will authorize insurance, commissions will authorize a variety of insurance products where you can actually risk shift the Superfund liability that you may be confronted. All right, how do these Superfund sites get started? We've talked about all these things. How does it really start in practice? Well, EPA, the Congress back in 1980 said, well, what we're going to do, we're going to have an all-in free. Everyone's got to report once. It was going to be June of 1981. Everyone had to go ahead and list all these sites. And that was going to be the original list of sites. Now, it's come a long way since 1981 and the original list of Superfund sites. But that was the historic start. Section 103A, as I mentioned, created an immediate reporting obligation to the National Response Center, the same place that took the information from your Clean Water Act spills, to say, oh, I got a new spill release. You have a 2-hour reporting of a release of a reportable quantity of a particular hazard substance within 24 hours to the environment. And again, it's patterned just after the Clean Water Act. If you're familiar with how you report spills to the waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act, you'll have a good understanding about how you're supposed to report spills to the land and the sediments of the United States. This is a pretty serious obligation. We compelled a party to file a report of a very high level of PCBs that were found in the environment, and later learned that the report went up here to the FBI center and went all through the country because it was a very large amount of PCBs in an unexpected place. But with that in turn filters back to the state that says someone's got to take care of this, someone's got to step in and oversee this. And so I can tell you from practical experience, the reporting obligations will create a Superfund site and will and start the triggering of responses in accordance with the NCP pursuant to these reporting obligations. Now, once the Superfund site comes to the attention of EPA or sometimes the states, what happens? Well, Section 104 of EPA established that they have the authority to act on its own, or it can authorize a responsible party or direct a responsible party to respond on the NCP. One of the things that's a very common thing you'll hear about under Superfund practice, EPA, if they want to find out about a site, they know a little bit that something's been spilled, they'll issue an infamous 104C requirement.
Should be E.
Should be E.
Yeah.
That's a typo. I'd like you to go ahead and everyone mark their pages. So that's 104E. A little handwriting glitch here, and I apologize for that. 104E is actually an environmental subpoena. It asks for information, documents. Some of our 104E responses have been long enough to fill the length of this table in terms of 3-ring binders of information, and of course, now electronic data. It's from this information that EPA gets that they decide whether or not they want to take further action or whether there's a real problem or not. Simply, states also have reporting systems that identify potential sites to EPA. And this process, and that's how the process basically goes. Now, if there is evidence that a particular site is creating substantial and imminent and substantial endangerment to human health or the environment, EPA has an even stronger tool, and it's called a 106 authority. That's an abatement order where EPA issues you an order that says you will take action within X days or you will face trouble damages and other enforcement sanctions. You can't challenge that order, that it's unnecessary. You need to either do the work and then afterwards challenge them that it's not, or face the fact that they may do the work and charge you for it with trouble damages or otherwise seek other enforcement sanctions. It's a very powerful tool that EPA has, and it's used for most part judiciously by EPA to not require people to go out and do things under penalty of trouble damages. But nevertheless, it's a potent weapon that EPA has. So we spoke about this before. So when EPA gets involved through one of the messages I just talked about, what's their first effort? The first effort is to find responsible parties and compel acceptance. One of the ways they'll find about it is the 104E process. They'll talk to states. They'll come out. They'll send inspectors to the site. They'll interview people and they'll hold public meetings. And they'll ask responsible parties to do that. Now, what are they going to do? They're going to comply with the NCP. And there's two different categories of Superfund cleanup actions. And they're logically distinguished between whether they're short-term or long-term. Short-term actions are removal actions to address contamination of immediate concern. They're generally limited in time and in a statute limited in dollar amount, what EPA can spend. Remedial actions are long-term actions to permanently clean up a site. What I've seen commonly happen is, it happened in New York State with a client of mine. There was a site where there was a series of drums that were stored. How they got there, I'm not quite sure. But in any event, a series of drums got staged. They were creating a risk. There was a danger to human health and environment. EPA had response action money. They had removal money. EPA had a contractor swoop in, cleaned up all the drums on the top of the site, and then they came back after other responsible parties, which my client was one, arguably, and said, pay us for this removal action. Now, New York DEC had other authority and more money at the time to clean up the underlying ground. So EPA stepped away. New York DEC came in under the state authorities and called for remedial action. And remedial action has actually been taken. In fact, after 10 years, I just got a letter yesterday that said our final payment is due. I haven't seen this in 10 years, but it took them 10 years to get it cleaned up. But the state action has finally been done. But that's a remedial action. That took care of everything that was below the ground surface that needed to be basically taken care of. There's probably, what's it, Adam? The number of sites, there's a big, huge list, service list that EPA keeps of contaminated sites. And it's got 300,000.
It's not that high, but it's I think in the tens of the 5 figures.
Oh no, maybe 3. Anyway,
It's a lot.
It's a lot. And of these thousands of sites that EPA knows about, some sites are deemed to be so polluted, so of such concern that they're put on the national priority list. And that means, and the big distinction between that, as I mentioned, you can have a site that's contaminated and it may or may not be addressed by government authorities or private parties, and it may sit for a very long time. If you're on the national priority list site, your site will be cleaned up because EPA will be on that site and they will be either directing you through a consent order to get it cleaned up, where they will put in a federal contractor, and the federal contractor will clean it up, and then they'll come after you and charge you for that. Most sites are done through private agreements with EPA. You know, again, somewhat apocryphal, but probably somewhat accurate. If you clean up a site on the private sector, it'll probably charge you, they'll probably do it for about 33% of the cost that EPA will do it for, because it'll take EPA longer to do it, and there'll be more, the EPA contractors seem to charge more. And so a lot of private parties are highly incentivized, if they see they have a responsibility at Superfund, go ahead and clean up the site themselves. One of the critical aspects of Superfund, and another part of what I think I would call our intellectual infrastructure for how we as a country deal with contaminated sites, is this concept of risk-based cleanup. Now, it's always been around, but EPA and Superfund really have enshrined it as a fundamental concept, which is to say a good bit of our environment is cleaned up. Because of another case I've done, I can tell you what your level of, frankly, PCB inhalation will be here on M Street, because there is actually some airborne PCBs that are floating around DC in every major urban area, just because that's the way it is. But that's not meaning that there's a risk here, and that's not meaning anyone's cleaning any of this place up. EPA, basically, all the cleanup is done on a risk-based standard, and EPA looks into what the contamination is, and then it looks at various risk factors. If this were to be ingested by someone, if this were to be inhaled by a person, if this were to be ingested by an infant or a neonatal situation, if this were to be ingested or exposed, if there were to be dermal exposure to somebody, all of the various possible risk scenarios are taken into into account, and a decision is made as to how clean do we need to get this so that all the likely people who may come in contact with this contamination will be protected. And the thing, I threw this one thing out, that there's a lot more to this, but early on, EPA came up with the idea that the greatest risk for most of these toxic materials is oncology risk, cancer risk. Now, I think you probably read statistics that I think it's probably 1 in 3 Americans will get cancer in their lifetime, something like that. It's a high number. There's some theories out there, I'm not an oncologist, that most cancer has some form of genetic origin, you know. But it's undoubtedly true that a lot of cancers in our country and around the world are caused by toxins who will either work with the genetic disposition of a particular person or individually trigger a cancer response. And so EPA is quite sensitive to making sure that a Superfund cleanup leaves the site at exposure levels that are fine. And there's a range. And you'll see this 1 cancer death, 1 excess cancer death, that's 1 to 10 to the 5th, to 1 excess cancer death, to 1 in 10 to the 6th, or 1 in a million. So if you get the contaminants that are out there and you relate it to the studies, the animal studies and other biological and other medical studies that say the data says, just like you look at for cancer, for smoking risk, et cetera, I will actually, if it's 10 milligrams of contaminant X, will in laboratory animals and other scientific modeling suggest there will be an additional death in the population of 1 million. Well, then you got to lower that contaminant level from 10 to 8 to 5 to 2, whatever it happens to be. On the other hand, if you say this contaminant level at 10 doesn't provide any extra cancer deaths, or maybe it's 1 extra cancer death per 10 million or 100 million, well, then you say, well, that's not too much of a risk, and that's a risk that's acceptable. You know, a big question, this generates a huge and important national conversation about how safe is safe and how clean is clean. Some people would argue that there is no such thing as a safe level of exposure to a toxin. On the other hand, you will read, under some vitamin labels that it has XYZ levels of selenium. which is a hazardous substance. And you need to take in a certain amount of minerals for human health. So there's an ongoing debate between whether or not a particular contaminant is healthy for you at certain levels, or whether it's really safe at certain levels or not. But in any event, there is a established level, and the levels change. I want to also, it's an introductory course, but let you know this is a constantly changing issue. A case that Adam and I dealt with recently is that EPA has changed the risk level for the exposure in indoor air to a particular volatile organic compound, TCE. And that was because some recent data suggested that in early months of pregnancy, you will find you'll find birth defects if, in fact, the mother is exposed to this particular contaminant at a particular level. So they ratcheted down the amount of TCE that you could normally find in indoor air and consider that level to be safe. We'll say, well, this is ridiculous. This is unduly conservative. This is absolutely crazy. But nevertheless, it's an ongoing debate between public health officials, doctors, and contaminants. EPA is put in the unenviable position of having to make a call here. And if you need to find out how clean is clean, you need to go to the most recent EPA guidance and under the NCP, and you'll find out how that works. But that's what makes this whole thing quite interesting and really quite challenging, because you'll have a site that will have a certain amount of contaminants, and you'll need to go ahead and get it cleaned up so that you protect human health and environment. And the question will be, how clean is that? So real quickly, how does this all work in practice? Well, if you think you have a site that's contaminated, you'll do a preliminary assessment, and then you'll decide whether there's a presence or absence of a contaminant. And then, Adam and I did one of those recently. PA is simply presence of a contaminant or hazardous substance or not. Then you do a site investigation that says, is it distributed enough? Is it in exposure scenarios? Are there receptors of concern? Should you go forward? You decide whether to list it on the NPL, yes or no. If it's not listed on the NPL, it generally gets referred back to the state for remediation or response under state law. If it goes under the federal program, the next step is called the RIFS. It's all very logical. You do a remedial investigation. You say, okay, where is the extent of the contamination? Always important. A Superfund site is never defined by the commercial barriers or the property boundaries or even natural boundaries, rivers, oceans. A site is where a contaminant has come to be located. And it may have been put into the ground or into the groundwater point here, and years later it's 10 miles away, 20 miles away, it's someplace else. That whole area is the site. And sites are in amazing areas. I mean, in Phoenix, Sky Harbor Airport sits on top of a site. It's a well-known site. The sites are all over the place. But once we decide, but a remedial investigation and the feasibility study says, okay, this is where it is. What can I do? If you decide that there's unreasonable risk, then you do a remedial design. It says, okay, in order to do this, I'll cap this landfill here. I'll pull this out of the ground and move it over here. Or I'll incinerate the contaminants if they're able to be incinerated or burned or thermally remedied, as they say sometimes. Then you have a remedial action. You'll do that. Then you'll construct the remedy, and when it's finally all built, and someone will EPA will come in and say, okay, I looked at what you've done good, you're complete, or you haven't completely finished up, you need to do that. And when you do a cleanup, in addition to following the NCP, you're required to file all relevant and appropriate requirements of federal and state laws. Now, one of the efficiencies that are built into Superfund is that if you have a site and you're under a Superfund cleanup order, you don't need to go out and get individual NIPSES permits or individual other permits. It's all covered underneath that federal cleanup program for the Superfund site. But you do need to take into account all appropriate and relevant state laws. So how are these site costs incurred? We'll go through one real common way to do it. EPA initiates a discussion with a group of people they think fit the 4 categories. They bring them into a room. They say, we want this to be a PRP lead site. Why don't you guys get together, come and form yourself into a group, come talk to us, tell us how you're going to do it. We'll write a consent order. You'll go forward with a consent order. In case you slip up or don't do what you're supposed to do, we'll have enforcement sanctions for you. But if you do what you're supposed to do, you'll clean it up, and everything will be good. And eventually you'll be gone. You'll be done. There are a variety of carrots that EPA has put in, that Congress has enabled EPA to put in place to join what is known as a PRP lead cleanup. First of all, if you agree with EPA, you'll clean it up, you'll get a covenant not to sue from EPA, which says, I'm not going to sue you for this. So you'll get contribution protection from others who may not have joined. It may actually give you a fair amount of certainty as to what your liability will be. And recalcitrant parties are always difficult. There are people that should be at the table helping you clean it up, but they may not want to join. If EPA says you guys are taking too long, you can't agree on a program, we're giving up on it, we're going to do a fund lead site. That means EPA will take the lead, they'll use one of their contractors, and then they'll go out and clean up the site, and then they will recover all their costs from you in a separate federal claim action against you. As I mentioned, U.S. government agencies may be a responsible party, just like any other responsible party. We had one great case years ago in Boston Federal Court where one of the other responsible parties was the Coast Guard. We like the guys in the Coast Guard. They seem to be pretty rational guys. And our opponents were EPA and the Department of Justice. So we're all sitting there in the courthouse, and the guys from Justice say, well, Your Honor, the guys from the Coast Guard are sitting there with the rest of the private parties. They're part of the federal government. And the argument was, well, no, they're responsible parties too. They have liability for what they allegedly did. They're no different from us. Anyway, the judge gave them a separate table right between us. So we're all sat in the same cell. But the point being is that there are a wide range of parties who are who can be responsible and called to judgment. I'm going to go ahead so we have time for questions. You can see here PRP group formation is sort of a fascinating sidelight of the business, how people get together, what people like to do. One thing I will mention here, the allocation theory or putting equity in action. Superfund at its core is a statute for equitable justice. Hundreds of court cases will say that. So if Adam and I are responsible jointly because he was the owner of the property when it was polluted and I'm the current owner of the property, so you can tell that I'm really the innocent guy and Adam really is the liable guy, but we're both theoretically liable, and we can't agree among ourselves as to our liability. We'll go to a court, and the court will say, just like Solomon say, the biblical say, well, Adam, you're responsible for this, and Jeff, you're responsible for that. And the courts will actually give percentages. I mean, Adam, you did an analysis last year of hundreds of these, dozens of cases, where courts say 12.5% for Joe and 13.5% for Bob, and Sue, you have 0, et cetera. And that's how the allocation is done. Now, when Vice President Gore was a senator and they were trying to come up to amend Superfund to make it a little more streamlined, he came up with 5 or 6, 8 categories.
Which the courts have now tweaked, and some circuits have come up with, they boiled them down to 4, but he came up with factors.
Yeah, well, that's what we call them, the Gore factors, regardless of how many there are left, and the fact that Vice President's no longer doing this. The Gore factors are an important development in the Superfund law because it tells you exactly how the equitable process should be filtered out. So, I want to go ahead and just go very briefly to the brownfields program because we talked about a little bit about brownfields. The challenge that Superfund first posed was that if everyone had the strict liability and it was without regard to fault, and if the liabilities could be these huge numbers to clean up these sites, and even the people who were willing to show up there couldn't afford that cleanup, that basically left a lot of properties contaminated. And what we found is usually to be in urban situations, in urban inner cities areas, and these properties were just avoided. No one wanted to develop them. They were a drain on the tax base for whatever local government was there. They didn't provide any employment opportunities because no one would build a factory or a business or a commercial establishment. And so Congress said, we got to remedy this. We got to create a brownfields program that says if you're restoring these things, you're not going to be liable for that historical liability. And so in short, EPA came up with a brownfields definition back, I think it was 2002, the Brownfields Act. And it allowed people, if you did certain things in advance before acquiring the property, you could go ahead, and that's what these things are down here, the bona fide prospective purchaser, acquisitions, and various, Congress put in, and EPA has been very diligent and helpful in orchestrating regulations to say how you're not actually liable. So you can disregard everything I've been telling you for the last 55 minutes if you otherwise qualify for these brownfields protections. And the goal of that is to take these properties which have been sitting vacant because no one wanted to be tagged with liability and put them back into protected use. And so with that, there may be some questions out there. I wanted to leave some time for Brett for that. So if that's okay with you, we go there.
Thanks. One we have from the web, as folks in the room think of theirs, Sean asks a little bit more about the overlap and how RCRA and CERCLA work together, and if there are any like glaring gaps in the regulatory framework.
I mean, the biggest overlap is, and I didn't go into it just for time limit reasons, but RCRA does have a remedial program as part of it, and a lot of how it works overlaps with what CERCLA does. The key difference, though, is that RCRA's cleanup program is very tied to a facility. So as Jeff noted, CERCLA is really broad, right? I mean, current owners, past owners, rangers. The RCRA corrective action program it's a cleanup. It's not a lot of the management of waste that we talked about, and it's if your facility leaks it, but it's very tied to the facility. So it does have more property boundaries and needs to come from a facility. So it's different in that regard, but there's overlap there for sure.
Right. I think the cleanup goals will be the same.
Right.
The same cleanup standards of risk-based protection will be there for both federal and the corrective action program under RCRA and Superfund. A lot of it depends upon where you're located and what your state is, so whether or not you have a collaboration between state and federal authorities on that. So in one site up in Region 1, we had a long-standing state cleanup going on, and then EPA came in and said, oh, I got this new problem, and it's different contaminant, et cetera. So we go to the region folks and say, but wouldn't you just soon have Mass DEP control the site because they've done so much else? They said, sure, because I didn't want a federal consent order along with my DEC orders. And Massachusetts had a privatized program for LSP, so they were cleaning it up without direct agency involvement. EPA was fine with that, and so they relinquished jurisdiction. So you will find corrective action and Superfund working together depending upon your jurisdiction and specifics.
Questions in the room?
So forgive me if this case is too specific, but I'm thinking of how like multiple states took a SARCO to court under CERCLA for failing to pay for cleanup. And Washington State was able to get like 90% of its costs paid by a SARCO, and Texas only like 58%. So why would there be that inequity in how much states were able to get under a settlement?
So are you saying where was the site?
So a SARCO, I guess this was when they declared bankruptcy, had multiple sites all over the country, and these were all states that were trying to get money for cleanup under CERCLA for these sites.
My guess, it's probably a mixture of, it's going to be, I think, directly tied to the number of PRPs and solvency. So if Texas said, well, we want to get some money, and, there were 100 PRPs, and, Texas was in there too, and there were a lot more viable parties to take money from, they need a lower percentage because you get everyone with this little share, that little share. Whereas if Washington State said, I got, I don't know, but maybe they had 5 sites, and then there was some PRP who was very solvent and had really done all the vast majority. Then the principles Jeff talked about, trying to do equity and divide this thing is like, yeah, really, Washington, you didn't do anything, so you get 90% back. But I'm guessing it relates to, again, PRPs. And
it's a very fact-specific inquiry, and you have to really, this is really sausage making. You need to get into the particular facts of that particular case. And we do this a fair amount every day, and so we have a list of experts that we actually work with and we call upon. And there's a wide range of considerations regarding how this cost gets split up. And I will tell you that as in many settlements, I think you say everyone's got a battle plan until the first shot is fired, then it's all commotion and crazy. Everyone will walk into a room or to a courtroom or a federal magistrate judge who's mediating this, and everyone will have a good plan as to how you owe X percentage. And then after about 20 or 30 minutes or maybe an hour, all that goes out the window, and it's the price of pain and what gets out of you. And so there is an intellectual structure to it, but oftentimes the actual numbers you ask about, fair question, is a settlement number which is motivated by a wide range of factors beyond the statutory terms.
And just a final point on that, you mentioned with a bankruptcy, whole new wrinkle. It just is. So,
yeah.
Maybe one more. Anyone in the room? All right. Well, thank you both so much for being here. Please join me in thanking our panel today. Yeah, all the PowerPoints and the video of today's webinar will be available in the next couple days. You can check out the event archive page. It'll be there, along with all the other summer school sessions go up on a special summer school page on our website after next week. So do join us next week. We have product liability that'll round out our summer school session this year. And thanks again to Jeff and Adam for being here and putting this together for us. Have a great afternoon, everyone.